Hi folks, you're with Tassos today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for joining this radio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about what I think we can accept is a priority of the globalists in their "You'll Own Nothing and Be Happy" type program, World Economic Forum and so on, is to the creation of smart cities. Now, it's really going to be, the equivalent of herding people like cattle into, a massive concentration camp. They'll call it a smart city, and they'll dress it up as the pig with lipstick. But it's going to be modern day take on the medieval feudalism, or the feudalism of the serfdom of the medieval times, and even before that. So now there's a few things you can see in the UK at the moment. For example, they're trialling in area, Oxford, I think was one of them, where they're trialling a thing where you can't travel more than 15 minutes from where you live, or 15 minutes from the city centre it might be, but really only permitting a short distance. Now, the various grades of travel, to use your private car as versus public transport. So there are sort of various things there. But if you travel outside the area, you have to pay an extra tax. And I think it's more if you travel out the area more than, say, once a week or something like that, you pay an extra tax. Now, the EU has also recently brought in an additional tax, and they'll use climate change and all sorts of excuses. An additional tax for carbon generation, where you have to meet a certain sort of carbon related targets, or your output has to be limited or restricted to X amount. And if you exceed that, you have to pay taxes. Now, some of these taxes are universal, like an extra $1 a litre on petroleum, for example, or diesel fuel, and things like that, or extra taxes on gas, natural gas, or coal, and these things are allegedly to offset the effects of climate change. Now, whether you accept the climate change is an issue, but it's outrageously hyped up, or that it's a non-issue, or that it is a real issue, that's sort of a separate thing. But the idea is that the government says, we say there's a major problem. We don't have to prove it. We don't have to give you evidence, but we say you have to change your behavior and your living habits, your living standards. You have to change everything about your life, because we say you should and have to and must. And if you don't, we can get people with guns to come along and make you do it. So now, if they put it to a referendum saying, do you want to do this, it would lose. So already they've bypassed the political process and say, nah, we say that you do it, and that's the end of no debate or discussion here. And if you don't agree with it, we'll call you a fascist Nazi and you're Hitler and that sort of thing. So they'll just call you names. So or even worse, make sure you don't have a job or something like that. So I think there's a few strands that are all sort of, if you like, moving to a point of intersection. At one, you have the universal basic income. You have this idea of the collectivizing of the population into a particular, like a concentration camp area, which they'll call a smart city, where you can be monitored in every way 24/7. And then coming into that, the concept of everything will be centrally allocated. The job you do, everything, the services you can access, how many electrical appliances you have in your house, the books you're allowed to read, all that sort of stuff will be allocated. And this is going to be very much like the Soviet Union was in its height, or China, to some extent China is today, North Korea, those sorts of places where you couldn't travel without special government permission. You had to live within a small geographical area. I mean, there were exceptions, like if you were, say, a senior government official, you had more freedom to move. But there was, huge and tight control. Jobs were, I wouldn't say they were 100% allocated, but pretty much they were allocated. and it was also a scam. Like if they needed an engineer to work somewhere and you were just a basic technician, they'd simply upgrade your status to, okay, you're now an engineer and here's a bit of paper, so go and do this job. So they had that sort of thing. And if you look at the many engineering failures of the Soviet Union in all levels, civil and elsewhere, space engineering was something that they excelled in. But if you look at the failures of their agricultural engineering, civil engineering, you name it, then the quality of their engineers was always a bit so. Not that they didn't have some bright people here and there, they did, but their civil engineering failures were legendary even by today's standards. So that's where I think the strands are going. Now, I think the universal basic income, everyone's going to get paid $10,000 a year, for example, $10,000 a year, and you'll be allocated a job. Okay, you're going to work at the takeout food shop over there. You're going to be in that office counting numbers, and you're going to work over here sweeping the floor. And everyone will be allocated a job, and you'll all get the same income, give or take. Now, there'll be the usual corruptions that you get in totalitarian regimes. You've got more ideological purity than the next guy, so you get more benefits, things like that. Then you'll be allocated some sort of living quarters, a little cubicle somewhere. You may be allowed to marry, maybe not. Maybe you'll be allowed to procreate, probably not, or procreate with government permission. Not like it is in China. You're only allowed one child, so if there was anything like you had the abortion industry and the infanticide industry was huge. Maybe it still is. And because you're only allowed a certain amount of children, and because in a farm situation, there's a lot of farmers during that time, subsistence farms, then the daughter was no good, because not only did you have to pay for her dowry if she got married, but she couldn't do the same amount of work on the farm. So infanticide of young girls was practiced out of necessity, not because people wanted or didn't want to, but that was just the reality. So the authorities can impose a fantasy world on you, but you still have to live in reality. They can live in the fantasy world, but you can't. And this will be the same with these smart cities. So you'd be allocated some sort of living cubicle, an apartment or the equivalent of that. That'll be part of sort of your basic income package, and then you'll be permitted consumption of certain foodstuffs, so many insects a day, or that sort of thing, and it'll just go on. So there'll be nothing you can do if you want to travel somewhere. You're going to have to, it's going to be monitored by algorithmic monitoring to say, well, if you travel to here to there, or do this, or do such and such a thing, or whatever, you have your computer on for more than prescribed time, that's going to generate so much carbon, and you only get an allocated amount of carbon a month. If you exceed that, then you go to prison or something. There'll be various means they've got. Also, things like medical care. You'll have chip implants, and anything you do or eat or drink that doesn't fall within the parameters of your medical care, then again, you're going to be penalized. And there'll be some sort of. I don't think you'll be allowed choice in the sense that we understand it today. I think you'll simply be prevented from doing things. You try and get on board the train, and you won't be allowed to. Your ticket won't work, or your little your chip ID won't allow you. It'll cause an electric shock or a spasm of pain if you try and cross. There'll be things like that I think will be controlled. But things like individual choice and that sort of stuff, that won't exist. People with ideological purity, they may have some. And if you look at, say, the 1984 novel, when you get to the very highest levels of the ideological administration, that people there had discretion. They could switch off their propaganda units that were pumping out 24/7. They had various choices they could make, but only because they were deemed as being ideologically pure. the riffraff or people who may ask too many questions. No, you don't get no choice in nothing, buddy. You do what the fuck you're told or else. The penalties, things like, being sent to prison to do work, prisons, or just being, I don't know, just burned to a crisp at some sort of oven somewhere. You can imagine that the cost of keeping ideologically impure people might be considered too high, so they just want to, vaporize you into the, or maybe be like Soylent Green. You'll end up as fertilizer for the insects. Your dead body's thrown in with all the cockroaches, so they're going to eat you, and cockroaches can be recycled as food or something. I think it's going to be that gross in the future. But just having a look at the how do they transition from where we are now to that? They can't do it in one movement, so they have to do it in a series of steps. Each one sort of nudging us closer and closer to the end game, which they clearly have in mind already. If you look at a lot of the United Nations literature, they sort of in the basic architecture of the smart city and how people will be controlled, they've already got that in place, and they've obviously got more detailed plans around. So I think we're already on that pathway as it is. Now, in terms of traveling, not being allowed to travel, or having to pay serious penalties, that can be sort of a number of things. They can apply it this way, that if you want to travel outside of your district, more than 15 minutes from the downtown or your own house or something like that, if you're traveling to go to a job, they can say, okay, well, we're going to tax you because you've got paid employment. There can be that, but really, it can only be done in a smart city situation where we've got intense concentrations of populations. So, it was one of I think it was a Judge Dredd movie that I saw, where they've got this building that's like kilometers high, and it's a dystopian future of all these people living there, drug barons running the place and everything. I think that I looked at it when I first saw the movie some years ago, and I thought, gee whiz, that's dystopian. Now I think that probably is the future, or some approximation of it, where with these incredibly tall buildings with gazillions of people living there, it'll be a cluster of those, and that'll be the sort of the architecture of the smart city. But just having a look on the productivity thing, that if people can't travel in the most efficient way to their work, or to do anything for that matter, but to their work as an example, then how can you still administer the productivity angle, as you see here? If you have to, for example, I had to travel somewhere by, I normally do this traveling by car, and it's an hour and 20 minutes. And it comes almost exactly to that each time. So it's an hour and 20 minutes to get to this particular place. But a little while ago, my wife was using one car and the other one was getting in the mechanic shop. And so I had to do it by public transport. And it took me 3 hours and 20 minutes and to travel the same thing using public transport. Because the public transport wouldn't go point to point and where I wanted to go, so I had to sort of go on the circuitous route, and that took fucking forever. The coordination between taking the bus to here and then when the train left and vice versa meant that really out of that 3 hours and 20 minutes, an hour of it was chewed up just waiting for the next connection. So nonetheless, even at 2 hours and 20 minutes is still a big bite out of the productive work day. So I don't know how that's going to be administered. Do they insist that you can only travel a certain distance or get fined or taxed if you live within 500 meters of a train station, for example, or major bus terminus? Can you only be taxed or fined if you have the capacity to travel point to point to your work, for example, your work, but you choose not to do it? So it's your choice that becomes the problem, rather than the availability of the means to convey you from point A to point B. But in my case, traveling that particular thing, there just isn't the option. My own private vehicle is the only way I can make that journey efficiently. So how does the efficiency angle come in? So to bypass or get around that efficiency concern, massive population concentrations are the only way of doing it, so that everyone has an option of point-to-point transport, and only then can you bypass that productivity issue. For example, if it takes someone 6 to 7 hours a day to do the journey, to and from their work, then that just simply isn't going to, it just won't work out. That's not going to happen. So the reality has to kick back in at some point with the smart city, where they can put everyone into a point-to-point movement, which means there must be massive clusters of work, assuming people don't all work remotely. There must be massive clusters of workplaces. And there must be then massive clusters of population concentrations, so you can have true point-to-point transport and communications, and that's a critical factor that the globalists and their smart cities are going to have to address, which in turn will involve, as I say, these buildings that are kilometers high and housing gazillions of people in little fucking cubicles and that shit. So these are all going to be, but I think we're heading for that. So it's universal basic income, everyone living in cubicles, and then this huge concentrations and point to point. I mean, there are certain jobs you can do remotely, office jobs, for example, but there are other things like I don't know, delivering the fresh, cooking the fresh cockroaches and in the takeout food store and that sort of thing. You're going to have people who are actually there. So still, you're going to need people that travel from one place to another, whether the distance be short or long. But the streamlining of that transport, and that can only be done through massive population and urbanization. So I think we're all going to be corralled off from living rurally or living even in outer suburbs, and all be clustered into these concentration camps, which will become efficient for the globalists to manage and administer the serfs and the peasants under their control. You've been Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.